All right, by a show of hands, how many of you had one Thanksgiving meal? Just one? How many of you had two? Keep your hands up. All right, how many of you had three Thanksgiving? Oh, my people. That's great. Who in here is a Christmas person, like one of those weird Christmas fanatics, like, oh yeah, good, more than the first service. I said that and one person was like, eh? How does it feel to know that you have permission now to be Christmassy? You know, like before it was like God was displeased with you. You know, you have to be thankful first. Then you can move into Christmas. So welcome to the Christmas season. Okay, anyway, that was my attempt at a joke. Hey, good morning. My name is Josh, and I'm the teaching pastor here. If you are new here, I want to say welcome to One Hope. One of my favorite things about my job is that I get to meet with all the new people. Yes, it's so fun. I love getting to know people and hearing your stories. And so what I'd like to encourage you to do if you're new here is to introduce yourself. I would love to meet you. One of the best ways that you can do that is by filling out a Connect card. There's a card in the seat pocket in front of you. Says Connect card, or you belong here. And you just fill that out and drop it into the offering boxes in the back. I'll reach out to you this week. It'll be awesome. I want to tell you about a couple cool things that are coming up in the next few weeks. Next week, we're doing a child dedication, and basically what a child dedication is it's kind of like it's a ritual, it's a ceremony that we do as a church for the parents of new kids to say, hey, we are setting today the intention of raising our kids to value Jesus above everything, Jesus above sports, above academics, above popularity. We are raising our kids to pursue Jesus and Jesus first. And it's just a great thing that we do. I love child dedications because you see all these new babies, and then Steve he always does our dedications, and he always holds the babies, and then they're always like hitting him in the face, and I think that's hilarious. So anyway, you want to come for that. If you want to dedicate your child, here's what you do. Just email us at info@onehopetoledo.org. info@onehopetoledo.org. Remember the org. So some people are like, hey, I emailed you. And it's like, no, you emailed the com. You did not email the org. You did not email me. So email the org. info@onehopetoledo.org. Okay, so then the next week we're doing a baptism, and you can tell me I'm a little bit arrogant here. That's fine. I think we do baptisms better than any place in this city. Like, baptisms here are like fire. It is awesome. And so here's the thing. If you want to celebrate the new life that God's worked in you, get baptized. It's going to be awesome. And so the way that you do that is by emailing us at info@onehopetoledo.org. Yes. So that's just let us know, and then I can get you all the details on how to do that. Also, come on Baptism Sunday, because if you've been here, you know what we do. Everybody gets confetti, and not like the little tissue paper cheap confetti, like the gold, like big, it's heavy, and you got to throw it, and then basically Steve is vacuuming for like 7 days afterwards. It's super fun. Anyway. So that's December 15th. Also on December 15th, we are doing a special thing for the kids. We're going to have a snowball fight. So we've bought all these little cotton snowballs, and we bought these like cardboard fort things. So your kids are going to be able to like build a fort and then pelt each other with snowballs. It's going to be awesome. And so here's kind of why we do this. What I want to encourage you as parents to do is to let your kids invite a friend over the night before. Help your kids have a social life. Invite the kid to spend the night before, and then bring them to church the next morning, because what they're going to experience is a church that is fun and engaging and tells them about the love of Jesus. This might be the only time that your kids' friends hear this message. And one thing that you can do to help spread the good news of Jesus in this city is by encouraging your kids to have a social life and then forcing them to come to church. But they're going to love it. Okay, anyway. So that's December 15th. December 14th is the night that they're spending the night, just FYI. Put that in your calendars. Okay, I'm a little sick today, so I just want to apologize if every 3 minutes I have a 3-minute coughing fit. It's going to happen. Just get over it. I want to transition now into our message. If you've been with us, you know that we've been walking through this teaching series that we call The Story. And if I was going to kind of just give you the big idea of what the story is, I'd point to our graphic. Kathleen, who does our graphics and who leads us in worship, is amazing and amazing at everything she does. And one of those things is our graphics. So if you look at that graphic, what you'll see is that there is a bunch of different icons, and all those icons represent a different story. The kind of interesting thing about these icons is that they're single line drawings. So the artist puts his pen or pencil to the paper and doesn't pick it up until the drawing is complete. There's one line through each story. And Kat has kind of squished them all together so that there's one line through all the stories. That's the big idea of this series, that there is one story through all of the stories in Scripture. There's one message that God is trying to beat into our thick skulls, and it's this message that he loves us. It's a story about a high and holy God who creates people who make mistakes. And in spite of their mistakes, in spite of their sin, he pursues them and he gets them. That's the story. And so our hope is that through this series, when we kind of visit these individual stories, that number one, you see the story, these individual stories in a new way, but number two, that you see like the big picture, how this story is connected to all the other stories and how it's connected to the big story that God is telling. Today, we're going to be in it's a bit of a hard story. I'm just going to give you a heads up. And I want to start here. Have you ever had a memorable car ride? Like for some of us, maybe it's like the car ride out of your parents' house and into your dorm. And that car ride like represents a huge shift in your life. Or maybe one of the most memorable car rides that I have is like, I'm going to ask her out, so I'm nervous, this whole car ride. Or maybe you've had the car ride to the hospital where you're like wondering, is this person okay? Have you had a memorable car ride? The most memorable car ride that I've ever had happened a couple years ago. I used to work in Monroe, Michigan as a physical therapist assistant in a nursing home. And I remember this one car ride coming south on 75 away from work. And I took a snapshot because I remember looking out to the west and seeing the sunset. And it was one of those particularly memorable sunsets in that the colors they just seemed to be bigger. I remember the purple was so deep and the orange was so bright, and there was just like this beautiful contrast. And it was that time in the sunset in which the foreground or the things closer to you are dark because it's getting dark. And so I can see etched into these colors the silhouette of these trees and this house over here, and then kind of the overpass that had just gone under. And I have this picture so perfectly like burned into my mind because this was the moment. This was the car ride where I let myself breathe. 7 years before, God changed my life. There were three big things that happened right away when God stepped into my life. The first one was, he was like, hey bro, I'm real. And I was like, whoa, you are? Yes, this is cool. And all I wanted was more of him. I was 19 and I started waking up early to go pray, which I just think is a miracle for a 19-year-old guy to not sleep in. It's just like, wow, you have moved in my life, God. That's amazing. And so I was hungry for more of him. The second thing that happened was I discovered that there is a treasure trove of writings of people who have had experiences with him, who studied his word, and there's a treasure trove of all of these writings about who he is. We call it theology nowadays, but really it's an account of what these people learned in pursuit of God. And I was like, so people smarter than me have pursued God before me, and then they wrote about it. I want to know those things. And so I started just studying as much as I could. And then the third thing that happened was that God, in this sort of initial season in which he changed my life, the third thing that happened was he called me into ministry. And I remember having this moment where I just felt like he was just like, this burning drive that I have given you for me, you're going to pursue me, and I'm going to show you things and in my word, and I'm going to teach you about myself, and then you're going to teach other people about that. And I still, when I remember that moment, I could cry because it is the most beautiful. It's when God calls you and gives you purpose in your life, it is one of the most beautiful things that can happen to you. So 7 years later, I had been pursuing ministry my entire life. It was my dream. I wanted to do this. And so a friend sat me down and he said, hey, I'm starting a church. I'd like you to come. I was like, all right, sweet. So I was like, I've been doing church stuff for a long time. I know how to do this. And so I was a volunteer early on, and then about a year into the process, he sat me down and he was just like, hey, we're ready to hire a full-time staff, and we want it to be you. And I will never forget this moment. Because have you ever had a dream come true? It was like the moment in which everything that I'd been working for paid off. It was the moment in which the thing that I'd been hoping for, I'd finally received. And I remember this car ride because on my way home, it was the first time I let myself breathe because I had been working at this job for 7 years, and I had been working so hard in order to hopefully provide a platform to launch me into ministry. And I had been giving myself to this job, and this car ride was the last car ride home. I'm done with that life. I'm walking into something new. I'm walking into the thing that God has promised me. And then 2.5 years later, it all came crashing down. And that's a story for another time, but it was the most difficult thing I think I've ever been through. Have you ever had a dream die? And it kind of cast me into this season in which I was like fighting for my survival, right? Where's my next paycheck gonna come from? I have a family. And so I went crawling back to my employer and I was like, hey, you remember when you said this wasn't gonna work? It didn't. Can you hire me again? And they said, well, we got a job in Kalamazoo and we're kind of desperate. We'll pay you to commute there every day. So 6 days a week, I'd leave at 5 a.m., drive 2.5 hours to Kalamazoo, work a shift, drive 2.5 hours back, which came to be like a 12 to 13-hour day. And I did this about 6 days a week. And on the seventh day, God rested, but I didn't. And I was kind of working with a group to kind of start this church. And so it started this season. I remember walking into the nursing home, the new nursing home that I was going to work at. And I remember shutting the door to my car because I'm in the parking lot. And every step I took into that place was like a step out of the dream and into a harsh, terrible reality. I was doing this job because I had to. And I remember being like, God, why? Like, what is the purpose of this? I'm going back to this old life. I thought you had delivered me out of this. I don't understand why I'm going in this. It felt so purposeless. And on top of that, the future was this giant question mark, right? There was sort of a deep and unsettling insecurity and uncertainty because it was like, how am I going to provide for my family? I'm a temp worker here, and they're gonna replace me as soon as they can. How am I going to provide for my family in the future? And what does my career path look like? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? I remember just the heaviness and the instability that comes with being uncertain about your future. And on top of that, I was working these 12, 13-hour days, 6 days a week, and then trying doing what I could do for the church on the seventh day. And I was so tired. I got up at 5 to get home at 5 or 6 so that I could have time to spend with my kids. And the thought was, I'll have this time to spend with them. But the reality was that I walked in and I hit the couch and I was out. And I had this weight of guilt, like, am I being a good father in this moment? But I was so deeply tired. Have you ever been like so you just had zero energy? There's a word in Christianity for the season that I was in. There's a word from the scriptures that describes this kind of season. It's the word wandering. Wandering. There's 3 markers of a season of wandering. You're in a season in which you're wandering, in which you feel completely purposeless. Have you ever thought this? Why do we even do this? Like, why am I even trying? Why do I even try to work at this job when there's no advancement? Why do I work so hard in this marriage when it just doesn't seem to bring any healing to it? Why do I work so hard with my kids when they just grow up to make bad decisions? What is the purpose? What's the point? It feels purposeless. The second marker of a season of wandering is a giant question mark. The uncertainty leads to anxiety that further depletes you, and you feel so tired. But it's also like you don't know what you can stand on. And the difficulty of not knowing like what's coming, not knowing how to manage the problems that are coming, the difficulty of that just adds to the burden that is a season of wandering. The third sign or the third mark of a season of wandering is that you feel completely depleted. Have you ever thought, life feels like I'm giving to these people, and I'm giving to these people, and I'm giving to this people, and I'm giving to this job, and I got to do these things, and you hit the pillow at the end of the day thinking, man, I didn't get enough done, and then you wake up thinking, I didn't get enough sleep, and I've got so much to do today, and all of a sudden, you feel like you're in this season in which you're just giving, and nothing is filling you up anymore. It is so tiring. That's a season of wandering. If you've ever been in a season of wandering, you'll know this. There's two questions that are like on your mind when you realize this. The first question is, how did I get here? Like, you want to know, how did I get here? Because if you know how you got into it, then maybe you can see it coming in the future and you can prepare for it, or maybe you can even prevent it in the future. How do we get into the season of wandering? And then the other question is, how do I get out of this? Like, when does this end? How do I get out of this most difficult, dry, terrible time in my life? How does it end? This idea of wandering, the season of wandering, that word, it comes out of a story or a series of stories in the scriptures in which Israel was wandering. Israel wandered in the desert for 40 years. I think that my season of wandering lasted about 6 months. Theirs was 40 years. And so what I want to do today is I want to focus on one of the stories. It's kind of a group of stories, but I want to focus on one of them. It's the story at the beginning. It's how the wandering started. I want to start here because it's going to answer two of those questions. It's going to answer the question, how do we get into this? How did they get into this? And how do we get into it? And it's also going to answer this question, how do we get out? How do we get out of the season of wandering? So we're going to pick this up in Numbers chapter 13, if you brought your Bibles. I want to give you a little bit of context before we jump in. If you've been with us, you know that Israel was enslaved in Egypt. And so they were slaves, and they were forced to do labor. But then God delivered them, it says, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. It's just the symbol of strength and power. He delivers them through the plagues, and then he splits the Red Sea and completely swallows up Pharaoh's army. And then they go to the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, and it says that he touched the mountain, and it burst into flames. This mountain, can you imagine that? This mountain is all of a sudden on fire. Rocks don't burn. Like, that's amazing, just boom. And so they have these massive moments with God. And then you have to see their trajectory, because they're moving out of slavery through the wilderness and to the promised land. And the phrase used to describe the promised land over and over is that it is a land flowing with milk and honey. And what that means is there's abundance there. There's so many good things there. It means that life is going to be easy because there's a lot of fruit. You don't have to worry about where your food's coming from. You're just going to be able to pick it. It's flowing with milk and honey. That's their trajectory. And so where we find them in this story is they've sent out spies to kind of survey the land, because the question is okay, there's people living there, and we got to take it, so how are we going to do that? So they send the spies, and the spies are okay, these people, they're supposed to find out who lives where are the strong cities, let's figure out how to take this land, and that's kind of where we find the story at the beginning. That's where we start, and this is the beginning of their wandering. So we're in chapter 13, verse 25. It says this: At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. They'd taken some pomegranates and some grapes. And they told him, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people of the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Those are giants. I'd love to explain that story. I don't have time. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. Those are different tribes of people, and they dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." Okay, at this moment, I need you to stop, because we need to kind of put ourselves into this story. Imagine that you are an Israelite. You've been delivered from slavery, and God is taking you into the promised land, and it's flowing with milk and honey. And basically these spies, they come back and they're giving you the Christmas preview. They're telling you what kind of presents you got. You remember when you're a kid and you're like shaking the box? What is in this? That's what's going on. They're telling them about the gift that God is going to give them, and so they're excited because this is, man, tell me about my inheritance. Tell me about what I'm going to get. Tell me about the land that God has provided for us. Tell me about it. And the spies come, and they say it's too strong. And they say there's giants there. You have to feel what the congregation was feeling. You have to put yourself there. You have to feel the letdown, the groaning. You have to hear this. So Caleb is one of the spies, and he sees what's going on. There's groaning. He says, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it. So Caleb speaks up. He's like, hey, don't be depressed. We can do this. Then, verse 31, then the men who had gone up with him said, Caleb, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. Caleb, come on. Verse 32, so they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all of the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, those are the giants who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. I want you to see this because this is where the wandering starts. You got to know this about the spies. The spies were slaves. They were slaves. God delivered them through these plagues. He delivered them by splitting the Red Sea and then devouring the army of Pharaoh. He delivered them by taking them to this mountain that he sets on fire. Like, God is so powerful. They knew the power of God because they'd seen it. They also knew the promise of God, that God had promised to give them this land as a gift. He'd promised to drive out the inhabitants of the land before them. They knew the power and the promise of God, but what happened was they went through the land, and all of a sudden they started seeing the problems. All of a sudden they started seeing the giants, and they saw the heavily fortified cities, and they saw the strength of the people there. And all of a sudden, to the spies, the problems became bigger in their minds than the power and the promises of God. Here's the problem, and this is a hard word. This is where wandering starts. It starts with faithlessness. Ouch. It starts with faithlessness. You know what faithlessness is? Faithlessness is giving more weight to your problems than to the power and the promises of God. Faithlessness, what causes you to doubt the goodness of God and the power of God, is when you give more weight to your problems than to his promises and power. Now, here's the thing. As a preacher, I'm tempted here, because I'm squished for time, to just say, so don't be faithless. Okay? Good. Now let's move on. I don't think that that's actually helpful, because in this story, we see a lot more than that. I want to show you this, because there's a process to faithlessness. There's a way in the story that we can see how the doubt crept in. And I want to show you this because this is really crucial. If you want to be in a situation in which your attitude is that you love the power and the promises of God, and you know with confidence that God is bigger and better than your problems, and he can deal with your problems. If you want to stand in that, then here's what we have to fight. I want to show you this. This is, I want to show you there are two accounts, okay? So they come to the people to give this account, and this is in verse 27. He says, they say, the spies, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell there are strong. Their cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak there. That's report number one. Watch how it changes in about 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, it gets way worse. Here's the report number two. This is from verse 32. So they brought the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, And they go on to say, everybody is a giant. Okay, so catch this, right? They're saying, hey, there's milk and honey, there's some strong people, and there's giants. That's a problem. Then 5 minutes later, all of a sudden, the problems are way bigger. The land devours its inhabitants. Everybody's a giant. Do you see what happened? Their problems went from a problem to a very big problem. Have you ever heard this word that we use to describe this? It's the word overthink. Have you ever heard that word? Here's what an overthink is. Here's what happens when you overthink a problem. You focus on a problem, and that's okay because problems need to be dealt with. But the more you focus on it, and the more you think about it, and the more you fixate on it, and the more you ruminate on it, and the more you allow it to rob you of your sleep, and the more you focus, and the more time you give to this problem, all of a sudden it gets so much bigger in your mind. This is what happens. This is the power of our thoughts. Our thoughts can magnify anything. They can magnify our problems when we overthink them, or they can magnify the power and the promises of God. I want you to see this because this is so crucial. This is what led to their doubt in the goodness of God, was that they looked at their problems and they fixated only on the problems, and in their minds they grew. And this is contrast to a very different person. You remember Caleb, this is verse 30. Caleb quieted the people before Moses, and here's what he says. Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. There's two different accounts here. Caleb's like, dude, we got this. And the other spies are like, nuh-uh, we don't got this. Here's the difference. Caleb looked at his problems in the light of the power and the promises of God. What Caleb did was he went and spied out the land, and he remembered what God had done in his past. He remembered how God had saved them over and over. He remembered how God had promised to save them and then made good on his promise. Caleb marinated his mind in the power and the promises of God, and that produces a different result. When he looked at the problems, he said, God took all the firstborn of Egypt. He can kill these guys, you know? He looked at the problem and he said, God split the Red Sea, okay? Like, God can just do whatever he wants, it seems like, and he has promised that faithfulness to us. When Caleb looked at the problems, he said, no big deal. We got this. So here's the thing. Caleb didn't overthink the problem, but he also didn't ignore it. Because this is another strategy with our problems that can lead to faithlessness and doubt. Is when we ignore our problems, then they get bigger. There's two ways to magnify your problems. Ignore it or overthink it. Because when a problem hides in the dark and you don't address it, what do problems do? They get worse, and they get worse, and they get worse. So what Caleb does is he doesn't overthink the problems, and he doesn't ignore the problem. What he does is he marinates his mind. He gives more weight to the power and the promises of God than to the problems, and so he has a solution. This is a process in how faithlessness kind of creeps into our hearts. It's when we give more weight to our problems than the power and the promises of God. And one of the ways that it works is the overthink. You can overthink your problems. I want to show you another thing that happens to the to the spies that produces this faithlessness. I want to draw your attention to one phrase. This is in verse 32. They say, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that, quote, devours its inhabitants. When I was reading this passage, I was like, what does that mean? Was there like a sandstorm and everybody died? Like, or was there like a sinkhole like in Florida? Man, never go to Florida. Just like where a house just went, and is the land like literally, what does this mean? So there's a lot of like theories. My favorite one, I think the one that made the most sense to me at least, was from rabbinical teaching on this. So the rabbis, here's what they say. They say that a land devours its inhabitants. Here's what that means. When spies went to spy out the land, they saw a bunch of funerals. They saw a bunch of people being buried. And so this is a metaphor for like everybody in that land seems to die. And I want you to see this because there's two attitudes being contrast here. Caleb saw the same thing. The spies saw the same. They all saw the same thing, but they had two different reactions. The spies approach this with an attitude of scarcity. Their focus, the focus on their mind, is in what they lack. We don't have the strength to take these cities. We don't have the medicine to help us through this plague, which is another theory about what that means. People are dying from a plague. So we don't have what it takes to live in this land. And because they had an attitude that focuses on what they don't have, that focuses on their weakness, that focuses on their problems, because they had an attitude of scarcity, they interpreted that event as a bad thing. Look at that. People who come here die. But look at this. Caleb had a different attitude. When he marinates his mind in the power and the promises of God, he has a different attitude. His focus isn't on what he can't do and what the people of Israel can't do. His focus is on what God can do. And he looks at these funerals and he says, God is preparing the way. Everybody's dying here. We don't got to do nothing. We just got to come in here and we'll just take their house. They're already dead. That's what Caleb's attitude is. Can you see the massive difference that these people have in looking at the same event? And it comes from these attitudes. It's like, hey, if you go through life and your focus is on what you don't have, I don't have what it takes I don't deserve a good relationship because I'm a broken person. I have a lot of shame in my life. It leads to a lot of depression. I have a lot of anxiety because I worry about what I don't have in the future. If your attitude is focused on what you don't have, then you're going to look at the events that God is kind of bringing into your life and you're going to have doubt. But instead, if you can marinate your soul in the power and the promises of God, what he has done in your past, how he has shown up over and over and over, and how he has given you his goodness, and how he has used his power to change you. You used to be an angry person, now you're a peaceful person. You used to struggle with anxiety, now you can have confidence standing before a righteous and holy God. If you look at how God has shown up, that's going to change your mindset when you look at problems. You're going to have an attitude of abundance. Look what he can do instead of looking at what we can't do. And this is so crucial because this is what leads to the faithlessness. This is what leads to the attitude of, God, my problems are too big for you. It's when we focus on what we lack. It can become so easy to doubt in what God has. If you overthink it and if your attitude is one of scarcity, your problems are going to look so big to you that it's rational. It's completely rational. Look at how big these problems are, God. You've never solved a problem this big in my life before. You've never shown up in this way before. Look at how big this is. It's completely rational. But we can stop that by going back to the root, focusing on the power and the promises of God. I want to show you this because this is where the wandering starts. It starts in here. It doesn't start with an action or behavior. It starts inside of you. But here's the thing. Belief always produces behavior. Faith always produces action. What you believe influences what you do. I believe in gravity, so I'm not going to try and crowd surf right now because I'd squish these poor people in the front here. You know, gravity is true. So here's the thing. Belief influences our behavior. It starts with the belief, but here's what they did. Let's turn to the next few verses. It's in chapter 14, verse 1. Because they thought their problems were bigger than the power and the promises of God, here's what happens, 14 verse 1. Then all of the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land just to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, and this is kind of the key phrase, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Here's another hard word. If faithlessness was hard, what it produces is even harder. God calls this later in the chapter. He has the word rebellion. Rebellion. Here's what rebellion is. Rebellion is choosing the slavery of sin over the fruit and the blessing of God. We saw that this is how it works for them, right? They're going into the promised land. They have this land that God says, I'm going to give it to you. It's a gift. It's got a lot of good things. Don't you want it? And they're like, yeah, we want it. Oh, wait, there's a problem. And then what they want to do is they want to go back to the slavery. Isn't Isn't that like mind-blowing? But also, isn't that what we do every day? Paul looks at this. This is all over in Paul's writings, but explicitly in Romans 6 and 7. Paul has this idea of sin as slavery. And he says, here's your options. Really, as a Christian, here are your options. We have an old man, the flesh, is another word he uses for it. It's that, he calls it the body of sin and death, which doesn't sound like a good thing. It's collection of attitudes, wounds, beliefs, emotions. It's a collection of things that we used to be, that used to lead us not into life, but into more death. It's a collection of things that didn't do any good for us. They only led us away from God. But Paul's always one for good news too. He says, but there's also good news. You now, because of Jesus' death and resurrection, you have a new creation. Not an old man, but a new man. You have a new piece of who you are, and this represents the Spirit, the new creation, spirituality. It represents freedom, and I don't know any better way to describe the fruits of the blessing of God in the new creation than to go to the fruits of the Spirit. Do you know the fruits of the Spirit? It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. Man, I don't know about you, but I've had so many moments in my life where I'm like, man, God, can I have more peace? And he's like, I'm giving it to you. You just got to walk in it, right? like, hey, this is the new creation. This is a fruit of living out of what I've done for you. And I don't know if you've ever been in this moment in your life, God, man, all of my relationships are falling down, and I am not treating people very well. I'm a cranky person. I'm a prickly pear, as Steve says. I love that. I'm a prickly pear. I'm a prickly pear right now, God. And he's like, hey, that's the body of sin and death, bro. There is a new creation in you. And one of the fruits of it is love. Or I don't know if you've had that moment where, like, God, all of my life feels like depression and sadness, and there is so much brokenness in this world. And God says, yeah. In the new creation, you can have joy. And so much of the Christian life is choosing, in rebellion, is choosing to forego the fruits of the Spirit, like the good things that God gives us, and instead go back to the slavery of sin. That's what rebellion is. But I to be a good preacher, I got to remind you of this, that the rebellion, the wandering, it didn't start there. It started back here. It started inside of you. It started with your view of God and his power and his promises versus your view of the problems in your life. What leads to the rebellion is the faithlessness. The rebellion, the wandering rather, it didn't start at the rebellion. It started back in the faithlessness. But the rebellion definitely brought it about, sped it up. Because now, as a result of this, they go into a season of wandering. And I want to show you this because that kind of answers the question of, like, how did I get here? Well, how did you get here? Well, you magnified your problems, and you gave little weight to the power and the promises of God, and that led to a series of behaviors, and now you're off the path. Now life is hard. Now it's difficult. But the way out, that's question one, how to get here. The answer to question two, how do I get out of it? If those two things were hard, just wait for this, okay? This is 14, verse 26. See if you can guess God's answer to getting them out of the wilderness or the wandering. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "How long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I have heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing, I will do to you." Now remember, they said, we'd rather die in the wilderness. "Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and all of your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun." Those were the two good spies. "But your little ones, whom you said would become a prey, I'm going to bring them in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, And your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years, and you shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies, are you catching this, lies in the wilderness. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity for 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this I will do to this wicked congregation who are gathered together against me. That's the rebellion. In this wilderness, they shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. How do you think you get out of the season of wandering? The death. You die. I want to spend the rest of my time convincing you that this is a happy and a good thing. Okay, here's what death is. Spiritually speaking, in the gospel, here's what death is. Death is getting rid of everything that holds you back from God. Death is getting rid of everything that said, no, I don't want to follow him. I don't want to do the right thing. I want to, that body of sin and death that Paul talks about, that body that focuses and magnifies your problems, the body that's like, oh man, I really need to sin right now so that I can get my way. Like that part of you has got to die. But this is the best possible news because that is the body of sin and death. That is the body that pursues slavery. That is the thing that says, hey, I'd rather, instead of walking in faith and joy and peace and love, instead of walking in the fruits of the Spirit and self-control, I would rather go back to the sin that is slavery. That's the thing in you that dies. And here's the beauty of this. When that dies, your life gets so much easier. It gets so much better. Because all of a sudden, what happens is the thing inside of you that is tempting you to fixate on your problems, that thing gets real weak. And it's like, here I am. I'm trying to control you. It's not working. Because you're just like, boom, squish, gotcha. And all of a sudden, your heart and your soul basks in the presence of God and the power of God and the promises of God, and your life, it gets easier. It gets better. If you look at all the pagan religions, they all require a death. If you look at Buddhism, they require that you die to the attachments that you have in this world. There isn't a religion in the world that doesn't require a death. Like, you don't get out of this. There's no religion in the world that says, yeah, you how you are, you're great, you're perfect. There's no religion for that says that, because that's a fundamentally unbelievable message. If we are honest with ourselves, we make mistakes. We're not perfect. We have things in us that desire to work wrong in this world, to do things that don't lead to life for us or life to the people around us. There's something in us that has to die. But here is the beauty of Christianity, where every religion says there has to be a death to atone for your sins. Christianity says Jesus, God in the flesh, died for you. Because I think sometimes, like, this message can be really hard, right? Like, I'm going through a season of wandering and I am depleted. I feel purposeless. I have no idea what my future holds, and you feel deeply unsettled, and it's just such a difficult season. And sometimes the message that you have to die in order to get out of that can just feel like another weight that has been placed upon you by the church. But here's the good news of Christianity. If you can die to that, it will lead to a better life for you. But even if you don't feel like you have what it takes, even if you don't feel like you can do that, the good news of Christianity is that there is one who did it for you. That God, dwelling in the flesh, Jesus, gave himself so that you could get out of this season, whether you learn your lesson or not. That's the beauty and the generosity